6 p.m. on a Friday evening, no warning at all, no press conference, no leaked briefing, just Princess Catherine, alone in a garden at Windsor, speaking straight into a camera. Within minutes, it was the biggest royal story in a generation. But to understand why that single video hit as hard as it did, you have to go back 2 months to a hospital admission nobody explained, and a silence that got louder every day it continued. Before we get into how this actually unfolded, hit subscribe because we're breaking down the full timeline, how the press handled it, to what it reveals about how the modern monarchy manages a crisis. It started January the 17th. Kensington Palace released a short statement confirming the Princess of Wales had undergone planned abdominal surgery with up to 2 weeks in hospital. No diagnosis, no further detail, just a medical procedure described in the driest possible terms. A royal statement like this is a controlled release, a few sentences engineered to give the public exactly what the family has decided to share and nothing more. For the next several weeks, that single paragraph was the only thing anyone had. The early press response tells you how royal reporting actually works. Major outlets ran the palace statement almost word for word because there was nothing else to report. Royal correspondents called it a standard update on air. Unremarkable in tone, nobody was digging because a planned surgery followed by a fortnight in hospital was on its face routine. That mattered later. It set a baseline of calm that made the following weeks of silence feel, by contrast, increasingly strange. Catherine left hospital January the 29th, photographed briefly with William beside her. Palace sources said recovery was going well, with a return to duties expected after Easter. For a moment, it looked closed. A surgery, a recovery, a return date. Except the public wouldn't let it stay simple, because at the same time, something far more serious was unfolding. King Charles had just been diagnosed with cancer, announced February the 5th, only days after Catherine's surgery. His palace statement was notably more direct, naming the diagnosis explicitly, confirming regular treatment, and noting he'd stepped back from public duties. 2 major royal health stories, back to back, inside the same fortnight, one stated plainly, the other left deliberately vague. That contrast is exactly where public curiosity started building into something the palace couldn't fully control. This is worth pausing on because Charles's directness broke sharply from the family's own recent pattern. Queen Elizabeth's final 2 years ran on minimal disclosure, mobility issues cited without elaboration, vague enough to cover almost anything. Even her final hours in September 2022 were described only as doctors being concerned for her health, with family summoned to Balmoral hours before her death was announced. Prince Philip's hospital stays followed the same playbook. Multiple admissions across his final years, described only in the broadest terms, under observation, responding well to treatment, nothing more specific than that. For decades, the institution treated health as something managed through vague language, not explained through direct disclosure. Charles naming his diagnosis outright broke that pattern completely, and it's part of why the gap in detail around Catherine felt so glaring by comparison just weeks later. The family wasn't being consistent with its own most recent precedent, and the public noticed long before anyone explained why. Reaction to Charles's diagnosis was immediate, crossing party lines within hours. Because the statement had been so direct, there was little left to speculate about. The story ran hard for 48 hours, then settled into a steady rhythm, exactly what clear early disclosure tends to produce. Catherine's story, still governed by January's vaguer statement, would follow a completely different path. Weeks passed, no public appearance, no photograph. For a family whose entire identity depends on visibility, that absence became its own story. Tabloids grew increasingly speculative through February, running headlines built on unnamed sources, while broadsheets held a more cautious line. By the final week of February, the gap between what the palace was saying and what the public felt it deserved to know had grown wide enough that any new detail, however small, was guaranteed to dominate the news cycle the second it appeared. That moment came March the 10th, Mother's Day, nearly 7 weeks with no image, no update, Into that vacuum came a single photograph, and within hours, it turned a quiet recovery story into an international controversy. The image showed Catherine with her 3 children, smiling, informal, released through the palace's own channels and credited to William as photographer, meant to underline it as personal rather than official. Within hours, major photo agencies issued a formal kill notice, pulling it over visible signs of digital editing. A kill notice is issued by a wire agency like the Associated Press, Reuters, or Getty when an image no longer meets editorial standards for use. Here, agencies cited signs of manual manipulation around small details, including Princess Charlotte's sleeve and inconsistencies in the background, suggesting the photo had been digitally altered after the original was taken. Once a kill notice goes out, subscribing outlets are formally instructed to pull it entirely, including from anything already published online. It carries no legal weight. It simply protects the agency's own credibility because a manipulated image damages trust in everything else they distribute. For a family whose public image runs almost entirely on tightly controlled, professionally managed photography, having a wire agency formally disown a royal photo within hours was almost unheard of. Catherine posted a personal apology the next day, saying she'd been experimenting with the edits herself and was sorry for the confusion it caused. On its own, that's a minor, forgivable misstep, the kind of amateur editing mistake most people would forgive instantly. In the context of 7 weeks of near total silence, it read completely differently. The apology didn't end the story. It multiplied it. What followed was one of the strangest weeks in modern royal history. Public speculation so intense it trended globally, driven almost entirely by the absence of an answer rather than any actual new information. American cable news covered it. European papers that rarely touch royal stories ran it as major international news. Comedy shows on both sides of the Atlantic built entire segments mocking the palace's silence, unthinkable just a month earlier. Silence meant to protect a private recovery was now being read by millions as evidence something was being hidden. Here's what most people get wrong about the timeline. The manipulated photo wasn't the beginning of the concern. It was the moment 8 weeks of slowly building uncertainty finally boiled over. The photo was a spark landing on material that had already been drying out for weeks. William made a brief public appearance around this time and was pressed by reporters. He gave nothing beyond a general comment that she was doing well. That's the impossible position a future king sits in during a crisis like this. He can't ignore the questions without looking evasive, and he can't answer them without crossing a line the family had already, privately, decided not to cross. By the 3rd week of March, pressure on the palace had become nearly unmanageable through ordinary channels. Editorial boards openly debated in print how much further speculation they'd publish without confirmed facts. That pressure set the stage for what came next. Catherine bypassing the traditional palace statement entirely to speak directly to camera herself. The timing was unusual. 6 p.m. on a Friday is not when palace communications typically release major news, sometimes used deliberately to limit the immediate news cycle. Whatever the reasoning, the effect was enormous. This wasn't a press release. It was a video filmed at Adelaide Cottage, close enough to home that the setting itself signaled this was personal, not official. She confirmed that following her January surgery, tests had found cancer, and she was now undergoing preventative chemotherapy, a treatment using medication to target and destroy cancer cells, often with significant side effects, which is part of why the January recovery window had been so long in the first place. She explained she and William had chosen to keep it private while explaining everything to their children in an age-appropriate way, that the family needed time together before the world needed an explanation. That single sentence reframed everything. The silence people had spent 2 months criticizing wasn't evasion. It was 3 parents, one facing a serious diagnosis, protecting their children before protecting a headline. The reaction was immediate, and for a story that had spent weeks fueling mockery and conspiracy, it was remarkably unified. Political leaders across the UK issued support within the hour, The Prime Minister and the opposition leader releasing nearly identical messages, a rare moment of total agreement in a deeply divided political climate. Broadcasters interrupted regular programming to cover it live. Newspapers that had run speculative front pages for 3 weeks published editorials acknowledging their own coverage had gone too far. Social media, which had spent weeks driving mockery and open jokes, flipped almost overnight. The same accounts that had fueled the speculation now posting apology and support within hours. Buckingham Palace confirmed Charles had personally reached out to Catherine, offering support as someone managing his own cancer treatment at the exact same time. Two people within the same institution fighting cancer simultaneously, choosing two completely different approaches to disclosure. Charles went public within days, in direct clinical terms. Catherine took over 2 months, and only on her own terms, in her own words, filmed the way she chose to film it. That contrast says almost everything about how the modern royal family weighs privacy against institutional transparency, and how that line sits differently depending on role, children, and personal judgment. The press treated the two disclosures very differently once both were public. Charles has generated sympathy with little ongoing scrutiny of the communication itself. Catherine's, because of the 2-month gap and the photo scandal sitting in between, became a story about how the palace handled information almost as much as a story about her health. Analysts later pointed to the two cases side by side as something close to a case study in how disclosure timing shapes public narrative, independent of the medical facts themselves. William's schedule in the weeks after showed the balancing act clearly. He withdrew from a memorial service for his godfather hours before it began, no explanation given, then resumed limited engagements days later, this time leaning toward causes involving family life and mental health. He gave no interviews addressing her condition directly. Every appearance he made was read by the press as either reassurance or warning sign, when in most cases it was simply a father trying to hold ordinary life together for his children. Catherine's return to public life was managed with more precision than almost any royal event in recent memory. In June, she made a carefully planned appearance at Trooping the Colour, the annual parade marking the monarch's official birthday. Normally a long day involving a carriage procession, an extended balcony appearance, and a military flypast, the palace restructured the entire day around her limits rather than tradition. Carriage instead of horseback, arriving close to the start, departing right after the formal elements, skipping the physically demanding portions other royals typically stay for. The palace had already lowered expectations beforehand, so any sign of fatigue wouldn't spark fresh speculation. It functioned less as a full return to duty than as proof of life, visual confirmation that March's video was accurate, timed deliberately to reach roughly the same audience that had seen the original video months earlier. The final chapter came in September, a second video confirming she'd completed chemotherapy. She called it the hardest months of her life and said her focus now was simply staying cancer-free and spending time with her family. Coverage this time was calm, uncomplicated, nothing left to unwind. It marks the start of a gradual, self-paced return to public duties rather than one dramatic re-entry. What makes this whole sequence worth studying isn't just the health story. It's what it revealed about how a modern royal family navigates duty against privacy when the public demands both at once. Charles disclosed fast and directly, and scrutiny passed within days. Catherine disclosed on her own timeline, and the 2 months in between became one of the most intense periods of speculation the family has faced in years, driven as much by the vacuum as by the facts themselves. Set against Elizabeth's decades of vague disclosure and Philip's broad, careful statements, Charles's transparency was itself the real break from precedent. Catherine's approach sat somewhere in between. Neither was wrong. They were different people in different roles, making different calculations under the exact same institutional pressure at the same moment in the same family's history. By early 2025, Catherine had returned to a fuller schedule, though correspondents noted a noticeably paced approach, fewer engagements, and a greater willingness to withdraw at short notice. The palace has never confirmed a full return timeline and continues to treat her health as private beyond what she's chosen to share. That more than any single statement, may be the real legacy here. A family defined for generations by formal distance chose, in one of its most personal crises, to speak for itself, on camera, in its own words, when it was ready, and not a moment before. That's the complete picture, from the first surgery statement in January to the completion of treatment in September. If you found this useful, hit like and subscribe for more deep dives into the royal family, and we'll see you in the next one.